Welcome again, everyone. My name is Marty Anderson with RefugePoint. We are here today for what is the third and last installment in a webinar series on refugee skills building and access to labor mobility. And that's a webinar series hosted by RefugePoint, Talent Beyond Boundaries, and the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative. So in principle, the first session in this series was meant to focus more on the skills building side of things in host countries. The second session was meant to be a little bit more about access to labor mobility. And then this was meant to be the point where we brought those topics together. In reality, of course, those first two sessions did drift across both sides of that conversation and blur those lines a bit, as they should have done. And so we are not so much, I admit, covering new ground here today as picking up loose threads and we hope weaving them together into something that's probably not exactly a finished product, but that hopefully advances the conversation, linking these two ideas in some helpful, meaningful way. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge that just last week, the Refugee Labor Mobility Network hosted a very rich, detailed, informative discussion on train-to-hire programs for refugees. And I mention that for two reasons in particular. So first, I just want to take a moment to distinguish today's conversation from that one. In effect, today we are zooming out a bit from last week's discussion on train-to-hire models in order to consider skills building efforts a little more broadly. Or to put that the other way, we could think of last week's conversation on train-to-hire programs as something like a deep dive into a particular form of skills building. I'd add too that if last week's conversation was a little bit more about building out new train-to-hire programs, today's conversation will skew at least a little bit more towards inclusion in existing vocational programs. That said, the topics very definitely overlap, and so any of you who were on last week's call with us will probably hear some echoes of those ideas voiced here today. And then second, I mentioned last week's call or conversation because I want to highlight the real growing momentum behind the idea that skills building programs and other self-reliance efforts in host countries are linked not just to opportunities then and there in those host countries, but to other opportunities for solutions as well. And that includes access to labor mobility, of course. We saw this very nicely at last month's Global Refugee Forum Progress Review, where the opening plenary spotlight session was on employment. And that was on employment not just in host countries, but also through access to labor mobility too. And then we can see it here and now in the recent work of these two large networks, like the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative here today and the Refugee Labor Mobility Network last week. But there is so much more to be said and done, of course, and I hope the two groups can continue to sync efforts and messaging as we move forward. So with that, let me very briefly introduce our panelists for today. We will hear from Felix Sasai, the global lead for the Tertiary Refugee Student Network, Evelina Dahlgren, a jobs and migration consultant on East Africa for the World Bank, and Alexei Dudarev, a resettlement and complementary pathways officer for UNHCR. I should mention too that we had also planned to hear from Manal Stulgaitis, the higher education lead at UNHCR, but in the end, Manal was unable to join us, though I do believe that at least one of her colleagues has been able to join us and is certainly welcome to jump in the chat or the discussion part of the session a little bit later. We are going to try to make this as informal and engaging as we possibly can. But with just 1 hour, I think we can already anticipate that time will be very tight for questions and comments in the end. So throughout the discussion today, please do consider using the chat feature to add any thoughts you might have along the way. And likewise, panelists, please do keep your eyes on the chat too, and feel free to pivot if you'd like to work in responses to anything that you see there. And I will, of course, aim to do the same. So turning to a first question for our panelists, Felix, let me start with you. And let me start with a very common observation these days, and that, of course, an observation that, of course, we heard in the first two webinars in the series as well. And that is, in particular, difficulties related to documentation, including work and education credentials and identity documents. So a speaker in one of the earlier sessions observed that candidates and those supporting them spend an enormous amount of time and effort just attempting to collect and validate documents. What do you think it might look like to overcome this barrier, and in particular for purposes of refugee skills building programs? Thanks, Felix. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Martin. And also thanks for the opportunity to feature on this important webinar. Let's imagine you are skilled and cannot show proof of it. You can imagine how you fare with job opportunities that demand it. And unfortunately, that is a reality for many displaced persons and refugees. Many refugees have received, prior to fleeing their home countries, skills training that did not offer them professional certification, and which in most cases limits our chances of competing in the job market. And for those who may have the certificates, sometimes verifying them or verifying their credentials takes, forever. And so the way out for some of these challenges for refugees and displaced persons is, first of all, for host country education and training institutions or systems to begin to recognize refugees as part of its citizenry and offer equal opportunities. Although our situation may seem unique and must be given isolated, may seem unique, we must not be given isolated treatment that does not transform lives in the long term. If I should share some examples, some years back in Ghana, there was this policy for the Ghana identity card to be the sole document for social services, to participate in social services and formal services in Ghana. And because this policy was new at the time, refugees did not have access to secure the card. One, because it was expensive to acquire, and also because it was limited to Ghanaian nationals for the start. So this situation kind of deprived refugees from participating in economic activities. We could not open bank account. We could not apply for formal jobs because you will need the card to present as proof of being legal resident in the country. So this was a challenge for many refugees back at the time. But thanks to UNHCR's efforts, as of last year, the Ghana card has been issued to almost all refugees resident in Ghana. And this is one way we can ensure participation. We can ensure that there's access for refugees to also participate in economic activities, in employment opportunities, and that can bring about change and progress for a lot of the refugees. Another way to this
Felix,
situation
do you mind if I jump in and say, first of all, thank you so much for the very quick, important emphasis on the inclusion in national systems. Do you mind, though, if we turn to Alexi really quickly to see if he and UNHCR would like to come in on this point? And then if we have a bit more time, Felix, we'll circle back a little bit later. But in the meantime, Alexi, please do go ahead.
Thank you, Marty, and thank you, Felix. I think there is a clear connection with a particular type of documentation I want to talk about, which is the travel documents, which are critical for skills building programs that have mobility components. While in many hosting countries, there's still no process to issue a machine-readable refugee travel document that could provide safeguards like the right to return back to the country of first asylum, and that could also offer protection against refoulement from the country of destination. We have other examples in countries like Rwanda, Mozambique, where countries have integrated the process with the national travel document issuing authority that provides passports to its citizens. This, in practical terms, from the operational perspective, this increases accessibility, shortens processing times, increases transparency, validity periods, sustainability, and brings refugee travel documents more on par with national passports. It also ensures that refugee travel documents are considered alongside national passports as technical standards, and security advancements evolve and the environment moves towards the use of digital identity in travel documents, linking them better to services and global opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexi. It's really interesting to me that so far, much of what we've heard has been about the importance of what can be done with or in host countries and with host countries as partners, and yet that is often exactly the voice that is missing from a lot of these conversations. So it will be very important to build those relationships as we all move forward together. Evelina, let me turn to you, please, with the next question. A major theme in the first two sessions in this webinar series was the idea of skills alignment, or ensuring that training programs are designed to fill actual labor market needs. But this was spoken of in a couple of different ways. One approach would be something like a global market scan of in-demand jobs and training towards that more global sense of job opportunities. And another approach would be a more country-specific way to go about it. So specifically seeking to match the market needs in a particular refugee hosting country with those in a specific destination country, and then training to make that particular link. So what are the pros, cons, and trade-offs between these couple of approaches? Please. Thank you.
Thanks, Marty. Happy to elaborate on skills models and how we're thinking more broadly of skills, global skills partnerships at the World Bank and the migration agenda. Perhaps first, just to give a little bit of context, as Marty introduced us, I'm based in the World Bank's Africa East social policy practice, where I focus on labor and migration with a particular focus on youth in Africa. Just for context, one of the more pressing challenges in that region right now is youth employment. In Kenya alone, where I mostly work, we have about 1 million new workers entering the labor force every year, with only about 100,000 new formal jobs being created. In addition to that, about 1 million refugees also seeking employment in the same market. So increasingly pressed. On the other side of the coin, we see high-income countries across the globe facing severe labor shortages, as we know, due to aging and declining fertility. But so as part of our labor migration work at the World Bank, we are now piloting these global skills partnerships to support low-income countries where most of our projects are in, to better capitalize on their booming youths and their demographic dividend, while also cost effectively increasing the overall supply of in-demand skills. So the premise of the GSP is essentially we train workers in the origin with substantial financing from employers and industry in the destination countries. So for context, in Kenya, we're currently piloting a GSP for youth and refugees for the Canadian market in selected sectors. And I think a few things to highlight here related to your question on global skills and the different talent pools and which model to consider. My quick short answer is, ideally, yes, we would have multilateral talent pools with sort of global portable skills that employers can just pick and choose from, so that we can also optimize the number of pathways for migrants and refugees to choose from. And this is sort of what TBB has been doing with their talent catalog. I think where it gets tricky or slightly more challenging is when we introduce training and upskilling to the certification process, which a lot of the times is needed, not just because skills are the level of skills are lower or higher in one of the other places, but because they may be different. But so just coming back to the GSP model, a strong push, not just from the World Bank, but for those agencies that are really emphasizing and promoting these types of mobility schemes over maybe the hiring schemes, is that employers need to start investing in the skills training for both home and away tracks, which means that the training will be tailored to the specific needs of the employers most of the time, which tends to be fairly context and country specific. And in some cases, with the Kenya-Canada pilot, we know that for Canada, these regulations are set at provincial and local level. So even sort of more specific and makes it even harder to standardize. The other thing I think that we need to recognize is that some professions and some skills are just more easily standardized and transferable than others. I think a great example that we highlight in the report is the seafarer licensing exam. These are a universally recognized certification across the globe. We also see with digital and remote skills that a lot of the global leading employers have fairly similar standardized processes. But in other cases, one sector that we highlight a lot as in high demand in both origin and in destination is the construction sector. But again, just to give a little bit more detailed examples, when we did the skill assessment in Canada and Kenya, we noticed that, a carpenter in Kenya builds houses with cement and brick, and in Canada, it's by wood. So just to say that these things are not as straightforward. And so in those cases, we need to bring in upskilling or some sort of on-the-job training, apprenticeship. And again, who is going to come in and pay for this and ultimately set the parameters? And I think that's where it gets tricky to do this one sort of global market talent pool. But I think bottom line, in order to scale these smaller pilots that we see emerge now in many origin countries, we do need to move towards a more standardized credentialing system, at least for selected high demand professions. And for this to happen, countries that are serious about GSPs, or as IOM refers to them, skill mobility partnerships, need to come together and agree on common standards and regulations. And here I think it's the most important that the private sector is at the table, so that these sort of high-level government frameworks and agreements take into consideration the industry needs and make sure that these projects are very market and demand-driven.
Thanks, Evelina. First of all, thanks also to the RSRI in the chat for reminding everybody to please do add your thoughts and questions there in the chat so that we can try to respond to them as we go along. Evelina, I am so tempted to go off script with a couple of different questions for you here and now, but I will save them for later and instead stick with what we had planned, which is one quick follow-up question to you. So we are talking here about a wide range of actors who are not necessarily used to working together. That includes industry associations, credentialing and licensing authorities, unions, national, provincial, and municipal governments, NGOs, development organizations, finance organizations, employers. That is just the list that has already come up in the first two installments of this webinar series. There are surely more as well. So Evelina, how do we start to create some sense of working together amongst such a disparate group of actors, please?
The million-dollar question. I think this is fairly central to why some of these projects either succeed or fail. One thing that we do heavily emphasize in the GSP report that will circulate after this webinar that came out earlier this year is that stakeholder mapping needs to happen very early on in the project design, and projects need to clearly define these roles and responsibilities early on. I think the crux of the matter is we ultimately want to make these partnerships as ethical and as multi-win as possible. And for that to happen, several players need to be involved, from, as Martin said, from government to private sector, regulators, migrant communities themselves. And I think everyone here on the call that work in migration know that it's inherently complex for migration projects, because we're not just dealing with one sort of stakeholder group in one country, but we're tapping into two or more, which means there's different cultures, time zones, and it's not always straightforward. But the one model that I think a lot of refugees and migrant skills projects should take after and look into in more detail as we work on sort of capacity building and coordination is the migration ecosystem in the Philippines. They've managed to account for everything from skilling to integration, protection, remittances, return of migrants across many different destination markets. And I think because it is such a deeply rooted and well-managed system within the government, it's also managed to change the culture and the perception and the information around ethical migration in the country and also in nearby countries. And that's why I think it's largely attributed to why it's one of the more successful leading sending countries. But at the same time, also acknowledging that these systems takes time to build, institutional capacity, coordination, not built overnight. The Philippine model took decades to develop, took decades to bring in private sector, develop incentives for them to set up these training systems, link them to the centralized system within the government. And so I think just as much as we want to focus on getting people on the planes and into jobs, we also need to build the systems that will sustain and scale these corridors beyond the support, the short-term support that we from the development space can provide in the interim. So that's my short answer to a very complex question.
Thanks, Evelina. I see that your short answer to our complex question has already generated some thoughts and questions in the chat. Please do skim them, and we'll try to return to them a bit later when we turn to that part of the hour. Felix, let me turn to you now with the next question, though, please. So I guess this is related to that last question or to Evelina, but speakers in the first webinar series emphasized the importance of refugee choice, refugee agency, but then also the need for programs for training programs in particular, to be market-oriented. Is there any tension between these two ideas of refugee choice and market-oriented? And if so, how do we navigate that? Similarly, how do we communicate honestly and transparently with refugees in these programs about the potential for that tension, if it exists, not to mention the associated barriers, timelines, uncertainties, and all of the other challenges that refugees face trying to access these programs? Please go ahead, Felix.
Yeah, it is very true, Martin, that there is some tension between choice, which often is informed by talent, and market-oriented skill. Refugees must not be coerced to pursue skill programs that they do not have interest in or little interest in, even though they may be market relevant skills. We may accept to receive the training for the temporary associated benefits, but in the long run, we may not value it because then from the onset, there's no interest or little interest in such a training program. Also, choice comes from the location and period in which the training is being offered or provided. That offers that maximum outcome, experience, and exposure. You cannot train someone to become a professional mason electrician or a mechanic in under 6 months and expects that this person or individual will excel once he or she gets, a job opportunity. And also, programs must not be delivered in camps where there is little opportunity for people to, experience the relevance of the skill that they are receiving, the value associated with it, and what benefit it may bring to them in the long term. And so these are ways that I see the tension between choice and the market demand skill. That it should not just be about providing refugees skill training opportunities, but there must be also the opportunity for them to decide freely that this is what they want, and also giving them the place where it will give the maximum exposure to the importance of such skill. So we can look at the example of training somebody in a camp where they may have little opportunity to put those skills to practice. Imagine me being trained in a refugee camp where there are no vehicles. I'm being trained to be a mechanic, yet I cannot service vehicles in the camp. So in the end, I may have acquired a skill, but I cannot really practice it until I find myself in an environment where I can be able to put those skills to use, and with time gain experience and perhaps also explore other opportunities, including labor mobility opportunities. The second aspect of the question, as refugees, we are hungry for life-changing opportunities, and thus we tend to associate a lot of trust and high expectations to those opportunities. So once they are not clearly communicated and we realize that it is taking forever, some opportunities may come your way, and you may realize later that it has taken 2 years for it to materialize. And if such a situation happens, you may have blocked or missed out on other opportunities simply because you've set your eyes on one opportunity that is taking forever. I want to share my personal experience as a trained nurse with a bachelor's degree. I completed my studies, did 1 year of national service, which is mandatory in Ghana to be able to meet the licensing requirement to practice. Afterwards, I have not been able to secure employment, not because there are no opportunities in the host country for refugees to work in the health sector, but simply because the government itself has a backlog of Ghanaian trained nurses that it has not employed. So imagine me as a refugee, and on top of it, I did not even have the national identification document at the time to be able to go into formal employment. And so after training, I've not been able to secure a job to put my skills to use, and have to resort to exploring other opportunities. There has been times also when I have had mobility party opportunities to go work in a third country, but it has taken almost forever for this to really succeed, and also because the processes are not clearly communicated. How long it will take, what is required, what are the documentation processes that all of this will go through for it to succeed. So you end up waiting for this opportunity and it never happens. So for me, I think it is important for programs to really communicate clearly to refugees in terms of what we should expect, from such opportunities, what timelines are associated, what documentation will be required, so that we also prepare ourselves, whether we still want to, pursue such an opportunity or we want to channel our energy somewhere else. So I think it is really important that things are communicated clearly so that refugees don't bank their hopes waiting for one opportunity and end up still remaining in protracted situations. Thank you.
Thank you, Felix, especially for sharing a bit of your own personal experience with us too. Alexi, let me turn to you with one last question before we then look to the chat. In particular, The idea of inclusion of refugees in migration pathways presents a potential risk for refugees insofar as national programs are generally not created with refugee protection in mind. So this might call into question the viability of some job opportunities for refugees, in particular temporary ones, or those where the status in the destination country is dependent upon continued employment. So how do we layer these concerns onto our efforts to include refugees in training programs and related migration pathways? Please, Alexi.
Thank you, Marty. Indeed, many labor migration programs are designed for labor market efficiency, not for protection outcomes. However, from our perspective, complementary pathways, the mobility programs are such programs that have specific protection measures for refugees that are built into those programs will allow for those protection flexibilities. When there are no protection flexibilities or protection safeguards built in, refugees do face heightened vulnerabilities from precarious legal status, dependence on a particular employer, limited access to remedies, and the fact that the risk of loss of employment can translate into consequent loss of lawful stay. There are two ways in which refugee protection can be preserved in migration pathways. And with the first one, we kind of making a full circle going back to the beginning of our conversation today, because this is the access to multi-trip machine-readable refugee travel documents that have sufficient validity and that have possibility to be renewed at the embassy of the issuing country abroad. Refugees participating in mobility opportunities should, in principle, have the right to re-enter the first country of asylum, where they are protected from refoulement and enjoy the same rights and status that they had prior to the departure on the mobility pathway. And the second way of preserving protection is the meaningful access to asylum in receiving countries without time limits. When refugees are unable to return to their first country of asylum and don't have access to a different status that would allow them to remain in the country lawfully, they need to be able to seek asylum that would protect them from forced return and would allow them to remain in third country as long as they are in need of international protection. And lastly, just from a slightly different perspective, there is another issue that provides this opportunity to safeguard protection. And this is access to support mechanisms in the destination countries. Particularly access to the mechanisms that are offered by civil society, worker organizations, or refugee serving agencies. For refugees in labor pathways, this would mean access to legal aid, access to labor rights information, access to different complaints mechanisms, or access to monitoring of working conditions. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexi. And thanks to all three of you as we now turn our attention to some of the questions and comments that have come in through the chat. I cannot claim to have stayed fully on top of all of them, but I have been able to make note of at least a few that I would like to draw our attention to, starting with a couple that came in for you, Felix. I'm just going to read these two because you might interpret them a little bit differently than I would if I tried to paraphrase. So let me go quickly here and note, Felix, in Uganda and Ethiopia, we noted that issuing documentation is so key as it unlocks access. However, the understanding and adoption of those IDs by other stakeholders in these national systems has been a barrier in itself. For example, the licensing authorities have no process for this documentation. Do you face the same in Ghana? If yes, how have you worked around this? If no, how did you set this up successfully? That's one question to you, Felix. There was another one as well. Where do you see the potential of advancing African regional integration, i.e. ratification of free movement protocol or sub-regional bilaterals such as ECOWAS to resolve the issue of complementary pathways on the African continent, as this would cover settlement for all people on the move? Does your work advocate on broader pathways? And so I guess there, what I would draw attention to is just the idea of intra-regional labor mobility, not necessarily intercontinental labor mobility as we typically speak about it, and any opportunities that we might see for labor mobility in that regard. Felix, we do not have enough time for you to fully respond to both of those, but if you would like to either quickly try to cover them both or pick one and go with it, please do. Thanks. Over to you, Felix.
All right. Thank you, Martin. I will attempt to respond to the first question. I would say, frankly, the experience of documentation access in Ghana is almost easy compared to other contexts that I have experienced. For example, needing a travel document in Ghana can take almost 2 days now if you live very close to the issuing authority, especially for those who live in the city. You can literally walk to the Ghana Refugee Board today, giving your reason for wanting a passport, and by tomorrow or maybe in 2 days, you can access. That is how easy it is to get access to a travel document in Ghana. And also, as I had mentioned earlier, thanks to the intervention of UNHCR, refugees can access the Ghana identification document at a very discounted cost, that even if it is difficult for a refugee, at least they can be able to afford to acquire such a document. And again, in terms of movement, Ghana is a free country for everyone, regardless of status. You can choose to live in any part of Ghana once you have the means, whether you're a refugee or not. So these are some of the things that enables us living in Ghana, displaced persons and refugees, to be able to access certain opportunities. So I can say, yes, the context may be different, and what people experience in Uganda is not the same as what people here in Ghana experience. But of course, there's the need to continue advocating for national systems to recognize the existence of refugees and enable pathways that will ensure their survival in the countries where they are hosted. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Felix. Yeah, Alexi, go ahead, please.
Yeah, just a quick response on the issue of the intra-regional labor mobility. I think what's important there, because it does have great potential, but to realize that potential, those agreements, they should also include refugees in member states. So the participation in this labor mobility opportunities should not be predicated on the nationality of refugees, but rather on being a refugee in a particular state that is part to that agreement. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming in on that, Alexi. And then there was another question in the chat that I wanted to raise up. It looks like it is to both World Bank and UNHCR, and I guess I could add IOM to that as well. It reads, "It is very good to say, as Evelina did, that GSP, Global Skill Partnership countries, should come together to select several extra high skills occupations to standardize training. Is UNHCR or World Bank or IOM or the three working together with the Global Task Force on Labor Mobility planning any convening to make that real, or is it in progress somewhere?" Please go ahead. Any thoughts?
I can perhaps first take a stab at that question, which again, in theory is easier than in practice. But as I mentioned in my previous remarks, a lot of these gatherings as of now, we see a lot of regional labor network summits, etc., that are fairly high level government to government engagements and where we are present and other multilaterals. But I think what's key is also to bring this down a notch to the technical level and to bring private sector employers into the conversation. And then I think while we're working on this at a high level forum, we also need to at a local level start doing these assessments within training institutions to see what is the existing capacity, and can we tie this into many destination market at once. So just as an example, there's currently one globally recognized aged care health certificate being considered and developed by a smaller health organization in the US, and I believe ILO and WHO is also involved there. But so I mean, there needs to be a collaborative approach between some of the players on the ground and the employers that are looking for this labor, but also coordinated efforts through our convening bodies in the multilateral space. But I think that us alone are not going to be able to drive this work. We can work on these different projects within our portfolios step by step, and there'll be a lot of lessons learned. But for this to happen, I think there needs to be a bottom-up approach at both high level and technical level to get the actual skills needed into place. I don't know if Alexi want to come in on that as well.
Well, I can only echo our understanding of the complexity of the issue as well. Like we know that there's been several initiatives in the past, but they didn't have the required participation of the employers who are particularly well positioned to drive that process. So yeah, that would depend on their participation and them being active in moving this thing forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. I can note that I appreciate the question's reference to the Global Task Force on Labor Mobility and would love to think that those of us working within that group could pick up this discussion in one of our upcoming meetings and hopefully advance it in that setting as well. An interesting question came in just a few moments ago about links to diaspora groups. It reads, how can the Global Ubuntu Diaspora Alliance practically engage refugees and migrant communities in countries like Uganda to contribute skills, knowledge, and networks that support sustainable development partnerships between Europe and Africa? Zooming out from the particular framing of that question, I do think it's interesting to ask ourselves what the role of diaspora groups might be in supporting refugee access to skills building programs and refugee skills building, generally speaking, and then, of course, access to labor mobility too. Do any of you have any reflections on that question? Please jump in if you do.
Yeah, hi, Martin. I do not have a response to the question, but just asking for clarity. When you say diaspora group, is it a specific group of people living in the diaspora, for example, former refugees that will come back to also help other refugees? Is this the kind of group that is being referred to in the diaspora?
I would say from my perspective that yes, except that I don't know that they have to come back, so to speak, in order to be helpful. If that makes sense.
So in that case, I would say that yes, there's been some sort of progress from former refugees trying to help other refugees, connecting them to opportunities they come across in terms of sharing information about those opportunities. And even by a far extent, offering support to some refugees to apply for some of the opportunities. I would speak specifically in the area of higher education, the role that the Tertiary Refugee Student Network plays. as former beneficiaries of different scholarship opportunities, coming together to help other refugees also qualify and apply for higher education opportunities. So if this apply to mobility pathway programs, then I think, yes, there's some sort of support from former refugees coming down to refugees in camps to also access certain opportunities in the West or in other places, I would say. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Felix. Alexei, please.
Thank you. Just from our perspective, refugee-led diaspora groups are very, very helpful, very efficient in disseminating of accurate information, supporting access to legal service providers. They can often also in position to assist with administrative components of labor mobility programs, but might also need additional fundraising or helping with skills building of particular skills. At the same time, we know that they quite often particularly well positioned to provide support with messaging to the communities that might be required at different stage of program implementation. We know that there's been a lot of thinking, a lot of outreach to diaspora groups, also in migration space. More at the same time, I think that this is a component that can be, of course, reinforced, and this is the area where we can do more given the potential. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexei. Evelina, let me turn back to you with one more question I had made note of earlier, please. I was reading through the World Bank report on global skill partnerships earlier today, including the call-out box on including refugees and GSPs. It states in part, in designing GSPs for refugees, it is imperative to provide skilled training and migration opportunities, not just for refugees, but also for host communities. And then earlier when you were speaking, you also referenced the stay versus the away track. And so we have all mixed together, the idea of refugees and host community members, those who might stay, those who might travel. Why is it important to consider all of those different groups as we think through these programs? Please.
Thanks, Marty. First, on the just GSP track. So the rationale behind pursuing one home track and one away track is that we want to combat brain drain by increasing the total supply of labor in the origin country. And so the argument we're making is that there's a good cost-benefit analysis for employing the destination country to finance both the trainees that are going to stay back and enter the local labor market, but also the ones that are going to go back home, so or move to the destination country, given that the training in the origin is much cheaper. But in these projects, and as we emphasize in the report, there's also we believe a good opportunity to loop in refugees into the streamlined process and not always discuss refugee projects as separate from other labor mobility projects. I think there's an opportunity to streamline and to think of refugee inclusion in existing visa pathways. The rationale behind also including host communities is frankly the sensitivities around the complex social cohesion and the employment challenges that are faced, and also economic inclusion considerations in these spaces where the camps are present. And so for the NYOTA project, the Youth Employment World Bank Finance project in Kenya, we're including 10,000 refugees and host communities to really consider all those communities in those spaces that are in need of employment support and facilitation, both in the local labor market, but also in our wage tracks, such as the GSP. But there are some special considerations, as we've already touched on during the webinar. In terms of documentation, we've had some challenges to bring in refugees into the NIOTA project, given that it's not as straightforward to verify their eligibility for some of the projects that we have special vulnerability criteria for because of documentation challenges. The other is different types of legal visa pathways that are available for some refugees and some for nationals. And again, I'm bringing this back to technical level to the technical professionals on the call that are working on these projects on a day-to-day basis that are doing that heavy lifting, because it isn't as straightforward who is qualified for X pathway, who is eligible for another pathway. And I think here at a high-level advocacy level, there needs to be a greater push to include refugees into some of the more streamlined, bigger visa categories that nationals can migrate through.
Thanks very much, Evelina. As we start to turn towards concluding, I want to make note of the fact that a couple of very specific sort of requests for guidance have come in through the chat throughout the course of the conversation, including one that I wanted to mention where I'll read, for NGOs in host regions, in my case, Hong Kong, how to connect with potential employers in reception countries and build smaller scale train to hire programs. We could provide resources for more intensive individualized training, but we struggle with making the connections and hearing the needs from employers. I think that we are certainly here to try to help make exactly those sorts of connections and support each other as we think through how to build these programs. And so, Ali, if you're listening, do you mind just dropping the info at Self-Reliance at RSRI sort of email in the chat at some point so that people can follow up with that sort of question and we have somewhere to then take action on them, please? And then otherwise, while Ali is hopefully working on that, I was just going to pause and turn back to the three of you, Evelina, Alexi, Felix. Do you want to add any last thoughts as we start to wrap up, please? And it is A-okay if you do not have any last thoughts. I just wanted to give you a chance in case you do. Alexi, please go ahead.
No, just from our perspective, I would like to underline the importance of the protection dimension of those programs that have the mobility component. While the labor mobility pathways create a very, very unique opportunity to expand solutions to refugees, it's particularly important that protection considerations are not an afterthought, but a design element for those programs. And I think that was well illustrated by our conversation today. We started talking about documentation as a way to ensure protection, and then later the protection theme was constantly popping up in the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexi. Absolutely no pressure. Felix, Evelina, if you'd like to jump in, please do so.
Just on a quick last remark, we'll distribute and circulate the Global Skills Partnership report, Preparing Tomorrow's Workers for Home and Abroad, after this webinar. But want to just first recommend the first chapter where we do a deep dive into the demographic transition and the reshuffling of labor and labor demand and supply across the global north and south. And I see in the chat box that there's a lot of comments on job identifying job opportunities, etc. Just to say that there's going to be millions and millions of job opportunities in high income countries in the next coming 30 years. And a lot of the heavy lifting and the work needs to be done now by the teams on the call to really identify and think creatively about how we can create these pathways and set up these systems and build these pipelines to facilitate and funnel workers towards the destinations where these opportunities exist. The third chapter of the report is a design guide for policymakers, step by step, the key components of the projects, how to conduct institutional and labor market assessments, how to think through destination market mapping, to identify kind of good matches to your origin projects. But also to say that the GSP agenda is still in fairly early stages, and I think the more we can work together on this agenda, the better outcomes and the more success we'll have. Thank you very much.
Felix, your turn. If you would like to jump in, please.
Yeah, I have no addition to the discussion except to share that we as the Tertiary Refugee Student Network do well to connect refugees to opportunities, whether in employment or higher education. And so anyone interested or any organization interested to connect with refugees can come through the Tertiary Refugee Student Network, and we'll do well to disseminate information on those opportunities. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Thanks to all three of you. I'll close with a very similar thought to one that you just mentioned, Evelina. It's just to note that RefugePoint is very, very excited to be a part of these conversations about linking opportunities for train to hire, for skills building, for self-reliance in host countries with access to labor mobility and other third country solutions. And that includes in conversation with the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative, with the Global Task Force for Refugee Labor Mobility, and with all of you on the call here with us today. So we very much look forward to continuing this discussion and this work together as we move forward. With that, Ali, I will turn it to you to conclude everything today. Please go ahead. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Martin and panelists, for a great session. My name is Ali Gillespie. I'm the Network Engagement Coordinator with the RSRI. And I just wanted to highlight that the RSRI is really thrilled to introduce a new series this year called 12 Months, 12 Domains, which is a new learning and webinar series that takes a deeper look at the Self-Reliance Index measurement tool, one domain at a time. Each month, the series will spotlight one of the Self-Reliance Index's 12 domains, offering focused discussions, practical insights and resources, expert perspectives, and real-world case studies from practitioners and other members of the RSRI's community of practice. And so the first webinar in this series will examine the role of housing and shelter in advancing refugee self-reliance across different contexts. The panel discussion will aim to support stronger program design and policy alignment in recognizing housing as both an outcome of and a pathway to refugee self-reliance. So I'll include the registration link again in the chat, as well as the general RSRI email if you want to get in touch with us regarding any of the requests you shared in the chat today or anything else. But we look forward to welcoming you to our housing session on Wednesday. We'll also have a blog from our research partners at Bluemont coming out this week, highlighting findings from a housing intervention in Colombia using the Self-Reliance Index. And finally, next month, February, we will focus on food, the domain of food as it relates to refugee self-reliance, including food access, production, and its overall role. So we hope to see you at future webinars, and please be in touch. Thanks, Martin and all, for joining us, and I will close us out for today. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.